Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD, an educational and human interest show for those affected by prenatal alcohol exposure, their loved ones, and anyone else wanting to learn more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Brought to you by Patti Kasper. I'm your host and your FASD coach. And I am excited to welcome back to the mic Dr. Jerrod Brown, who is probably the most educated man I know, multiple degrees, and just such a wealth of information. So I hope you have a notebook and pen or pencil handy to take notes, because this is an episode you're not going to want to miss. It wasn't all that long ago that we talked about confabulation in one of our episodes. And that was one of my most listened to episodes of the podcast. And really, in order to support people with FASD, you have to understand both confabulation and today's topic, which is suggestibility. So that's what we have Dr. Brown back to take to just fill us in on everything that means. Welcome, Jerrod, to you. Glad to have
Hey,
you back.
Patty. Thanks for having me. Always great to be here.
All right. So where would you like to begin? It's a big
Let's
topic,
talk
right?
about suggestibility in general because it's not just folks with FASD that may be more prone to this,
Mhm.
but really we're all prone to this under the right circumstance. So,
Yeah, good
give you an
point.
example. Have you ever been in a room with someone who started yawning? Technically, that is a type of physiological suggestibility.
I always figured that had to do with mirror neurons.
Well, probably not,
Al-
but yeah.
Although, even just hearing the word, I am really fighting the urge to yawn. Thank you
Yeah, and
very much,
it
Jerrod.
yes, you're welcome. Always glad to help. So, have you ever watched TV and you saw a commercial?
And now
Right.
everyone in the audience is going to be yawning.
I know. Look how easy it is to, I mean, we're all prone to this on some level. So
Yeah.
that's more physiological based, but just being around like certain kind of media or advertisements,
Mhm.
and we're persuaded into doing something.
Yeah. Well, that's what the whole advertising industry is built upon, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And something called peer conformity too. Just think
Okay.
about your friendship network
Yeah.
and who's in your circle, and
Yeah.
maybe they like the same music or the same
Hmm.
celebrity or whatever, and you hear it over and over again, and you're just kind of nudged in that direction. Maybe you
Yeah.
didn't really like it, but now you think you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of
That's
dimensions to this.
And that triggered my thoughts into a variety of different directions. I was thinking of that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and thinking of the whole time growing up, especially as a youth, wanting to fit in and do what the cool kids do and all of that. But think of all the fads going around on social media, right? Where
Yeah.
that desire is so strong that people would eat Tide Pods. I mean, give me a break. That has to burn your mouth. I can't even handle a dishwasher pod without washing my hands afterward, because if you accidentally taste it, it's like acid. It's
Good.
awful.
Not good
So
at all.
so why are we talking about suggestibility and FASD?
Because it's pretty common among folks with FASD. I mean, it comes up all the time. It's in the literature.
Mhm.
So again, suggestibility, kind of a normal phenomenon. We're all prone to it under the right circumstance, but people with FASD are probably way more prone to this because of all the underlying deficits that we all talk about: executive function,
Mhm.
the reduced ability to handle uncertainty, memory issues,
Mhm.
fatigue, confusion, stress, not being able to understand complex questions, compliance. We'll talk about all these things. So Suggestibility can result from face-to-face communication or even remotely like this, one-on-one or in a group. It
Mhm.
could come from intentional sources, unintentional. It could be triggered by a memory distortion, where then now maybe we have confabulation and false memory creation. It can actually result from overhearing secondhand conversations.
Mhm.
But when we start thinking about the seriousness of this topic, let's say someone with FASD becomes involved in the legal system or the criminal
Mhm.
justice arena
Yeah.
in some capacity. This is where it could result in self-incriminating statements, false confessions.
Mhm.
Maybe the person who has FASD is an eyewitness to some sort of crime.
Mhm.
And we also need to think about this not just within the context of someone committing a crime, but eyewitness suggestibility is a big
Yeah.
factor too, which that
Yeah.
could taint the entire case.
Yeah. And I think that's why the police want to talk to as many different witnesses as they can, because the truth is somewhere in the middle of all those different perspectives, right? And it
Fact check,
takes an enormous
verify.
amount of time,
Yes,
right?
it does.
Yeah.
And when
So,
someone's confabulating during one of these interviews, it can really
mhm,
seem very convincing
yeah.
and believable. And unfortunately, in my experience, a high percentage of law enforcement criminal
Mhm,
justice interviewers haven't had a lot of training in FASD, if at
yeah.
all,
Yeah.
and they probably don't have a lot of training in confabulation or suggestibility in general as well,
Right.
because it's just not
Right.
taught a lot in the criminal justice degree programs.
Yeah. And I think of a couple important things that that kind of tie those two things together. But for those who are watching or listening to this episode who did not previously watch or listen to the episode on confabulation, can you fill us in pretty quickly on what that is and why these two are so related?
Confabulation is false memory creation, where the person may create a memory that is partially true
Hmm.
or completely illogical, where it could look like a delusion, or it could be a completely made up memory that they don't believe they're making up, but it sounds
Hmm.
believable still.
Hmm.
Something could be taken out of temporal context, where basically what that is someone's reporting something that they believe happened to them maybe yesterday. And you later find out they're talking about something that happened to them a couple years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
So dates and times can be mixed up.
Yeah.
And confabulation, think of false memory creation. There's no intent to deceive. So
Hmm.
the person is not doing it intentionally to lie. If the person
Yeah.
is intentionally lying, that is not confabulation, because the
Right.
key is intentionality. It's
Right.
unintentional. And people with FASD are more prone to this because of everything we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Memory confusion. Maybe they're embarrassed where they don't understand the question.
Hmm.
So they don't ask the interviewer, I just don't understand what you're saying. So they create something quick in their brain
Right.
that maybe makes sense to them, but it starts becoming just a story that
and
grows and
and looks
grows.
very suspicious to the police
Yeah,
if that's
absolutely.
who's talking to them. I couldn't help as you were laying this out a few moments ago, thinking about all those episodes of Law and Order, right? Who hasn't watched a gazillion of them? Where the police will lie or suggest something untrue to in with the purpose of gaining confession. And some of them are more concerned than others with it being truthful. And I would imagine that that leads so many of us with FASD particularly vulnerable because one, we're pleasers, and we definitely seek to please authority figures as a rule. Um, of course, that might not be the case if we happen to also have like oppositional defiant disorder or something like that, or some kind of authority figure based trauma. Um, but Yeah, that it seems like a recipe for disaster.
Connecting the dots is required in those situations. Strategic planning, good decision making, good
Mhm.
problem solving, good executive function. And unfortunately, if you believe the research on FASD, folks with FASD have deficits in all of those areas.
Yeah, yeah.
And what happens if the person is sleep deprived and they haven't eaten in hours? They're
Mhm.
confused and they're really scared as well. I mean,
Yeah,
that's tough for anybody, but someone
yeah,
that has an FASD brain, that is a recipe for disaster.
yeah. Or if they are vulnerable to the shenanigans of, hoodlums who are using them, they may be in situations where they are purposely deprived of nutrition or sleep just to keep them off balance and more easily manipulated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's a million things that can influence suggestibility. If you look at the suggestibility literature, and there's a ton, not FASD specific, there's some on FASD and suggestibility, but the very nature of having a lot of trauma in your life
Mhm.
may play a role. If somebody has a learning disability or a memory disability or attachment problems or language deficits or even theory of mind deficits,
And
all
all
of
of
these
those are
variables have been
common with
studied,
us.
every single one,
Yeah.
without a doubt. And interestingly, too, people that have a very high external locus of control
Mm.
and very poor self-regulation deficits, and people that lack assertiveness and have lower intellectual functioning capabilities, these are all things that may make that person more prone to being suggestible. So we talked about the criminal justice system, false confessions, wrongful alibi, but what happens if it's a mental health arena where that client with FASD is going to meet with a therapist for the first time? The therapist doesn't have training on any of this stuff. And the therapist is asking questions that they're not trying to be leading in their questions, or they ask a bunch of yes or no. What could happen in that arena? Misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis. What
Yeah.
happens if it's a student being interviewed for an IEP or some sort of education plan or going to a medical doctor? It's a
Yeah.
vulnerability in every one of these settings,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I had a
not
really
just the
good,
criminal justice system.
yeah, I had a really good point flit through my mind and it's gone.
It'll come back.
Probably in the
When
middle of
you
one of your sentences.
Patty, when you study suggestibility, it's equally important to understand the topic of compliance. And you kind of brought it up already. Compliance literature and suggestibility literature are talked a lot about together, not always. So if a person is compliant, they have a tendency to go along with other people's suggestions. So they have a
Mhm.
tendency to obey instructions, comply with requests. They're people pleasers.
Mhm.
And that's also a vulnerability.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets tricky. In some cases, someone could be very, very compliant on
Mhm.
the outside and go along with whatever the person says, but internally they may not agree with it, but
Yeah.
they're not going to speak up because they don't want to make that person mad or they
Yeah.
lack assertiveness. So
Yeah.
equally important to be aware of the topic of compliance.
And I think you made a really good point a few moments ago too when you said you were kind of alluding to the people asking the questions not being trained in these topics, right? I mean, non-police people, right? And you mentioned therapists. However, my mind went to all the obstetricians and doulas and nurses out there who know that they need to be asking screening questions for FASD, but they don't intentionally realize that their phrasing is suggesting an answer. For instance, you didn't drink while you were pregnant, did you? That tells the young woman, well, presumably young, to say no, because obviously the person who asked doesn't have time for the truth.
Anybody that does an interview, whatever setting it is, the more you can learn about effective interviewing strategies
Mhm.
and just to be aware of how common it is for any of us to ask suggested
Yeah.
questions. If you repeat a question over and over again, the same question to someone with FASD, that could trigger that person to have confabulation
Mhm.
because they may think the first answer they gave was incorrectly. So now they're being interviewed over and over and over again. They may shift what they originally said to
Mhm.
conform with what they think that person wants to hear.
Yeah. And
If you're asking
then,
a bunch of yes or no questions, true and false, forced kind of questions, those are very tricky and try to remove them
yeah,
from the vocabulary as much as
yeah.
humanly possible.
So forced choice being what? Multiple choice?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because maybe the client guesses correctly, so the interviewer thinks, oh, they know what they're talking about, but they really could have a 50% chance or a 25% chance of
Mhm.
getting it right, and they have no idea what they just agreed to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be aware too, here's another thing. What is going on in the interviewing room,
Mhm.
wherever it's at? Look around the room, scan it. How many people are in the room? What's the position of power the person is in?
Yeah.
Are they in a uniform? Look at the walls, wall clutter. That's something we don't think about because people with FASD, working memory deficits, sensory processing, if you have a bunch of pictures with bright colors on them,
Mhm.
problematic. If you are an interviewer and you're wearing cologne or perfume,
Mhm.
or there's incense candle or whatever,
Yeah.
that could trigger something. The
Yeah.
temperature of the room, the time of day. There's a million things to think about, but the interviewing room also has a lot to do with this besides
Yeah.
the interviewer.
Yeah. Or on the other hand, if it is very stark and sterile, that
Sure.
could trigger a lot of other things.
And the
Yeah.
duration of the interview is a big thing too, because people with FASD don't have a lot of cognitive reserve. So if that interview has gone on for hours and hours and hours, that person's brain is shot. They're going to
Yeah.
say anything they can to get the interview
Yeah.
to stop and to get
Yeah.
it over with.
Yeah. And that's a defensive thing.
Sure, could
Yeah.
be. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
They know it's that desire to get the interview over because you need energy left for something that lays ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
You want,
Uh,
can I just run through if your audience, well, I've taken the time to do this, so I'll save you all time. If you go through all the research literature that's ever been published on FASD and suggestibility together,
okay.
in a nutshell, this is what it says. Executive function impairments need to
Mhm.
be taken into account.
Yeah.
You need to be aware of interviewing situations that require the interviewee to have a high degree of cognitive sophistication.
Mhm.
So if that interviewee has lower levels of cognitive sophistication, problematic.
Yeah.
Be aware of the topic of acquiescence. So if someone has a tendency to just say and kind of just go with the flow,
Mhm.
problematic.
Yeah.
Underdeveloped coping strategies is another thing that's brought up. So if that client with FASD is being interviewed and they already have poor stress management skills or they
Mhm.
lack assertiveness, definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
If that interviewee has FASD and they're asked a lot of questions with technical jargon or legal jargon,
Mhm.
not good.
Yeah.
Plea agreements, oaths. What in the world does that mean to someone with FASD if they've
Yeah.
never been involved? I mean, they may give the head nod to the judge.
Yeah.
Yes, Your Honor, I understand what you're talking about.
And they
If
have
you
no
only
clue.
ask yes or no questions or rely on the old head nod and
Yeah.
not fact check and verify, those are classic examples of how people can mask comprehension.
Mhm. Mhm.
Developmental immaturity is talked about. So if someone with FASD is 40 years, 30 or 40 years old on paper, how do they function developmentally, socially, cognitively, emotionally? That's
Yeah.
another thing to be aware of.
Now, I know we often say, with dysmaturity, it's roughly half of someone's age, but one thing I've learned is that we tend to catch up with ourselves, by our mid-30s,
Yeah.
around there. So could we presume that a 30-year-old is still about 15, 20 it developmentally?
It's so tough to know because what happened, I've worked on cases where the client with FASD functions pretty close to their chronological age, but under stress,
Mhm.
under chronic sleep deprivation, that's out the window. What happens
Yeah,
if the client has a co-occurring brain injury or mental health or drug problems,
yeah.
or they've had tons and tons of childhood trauma on top of the prenatal exposure? So every situation is uniquely different.
Mhm.
But
And
we
that
do know that the core deficits of FASD from a brain-based lens are going to be those executive function impairments,
Mhm.
abstract reasoning, impulse control,
Yeah,
to name a few.
yeah, being able to make predictions, link
Yeah.
cause and effect. Yeah, yeah.
Another, two other variables, and we could talk all day about the variables, but two other variables that are talked about in the suggestibility and FASD literature is self-esteem dynamics is a big thing.
Mm,
So if that interviewee has very low self-esteem, they may lack assertiveness, they could be dealing with social anxiety,
mhm.
and they have such a desire to be liked by other people,
Yeah,
they're going to say anything they want. And then the
yeah.
other variable that we have talked about in two other podcasts is sleep deprivation.
Mhm.
And a high percentage of folks with FASD have sleep issues. So if that person with FASD is being interviewed and they're
Mhm.
chronically sleep deprived and maybe they haven't had a good night's sleep in several nights,
Yeah,
just think of how we feel when we don't sleep.
yeah,
We're slower, we're sluggish, our brains don't move as fast in
mm,
general. All of those things
yeah,
can make that client extremely vulnerable
yeah. And
being
and
interviewed
and
by
I think,
somebody.
yeah, it's harder to remember things when we're exhausted also.
Yes, yes,
Things that
definitely,
in different circumstances we'd know right off the bat.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, that was, by the way, another wildly popular episode.
Yeah, sleep's one of
Yeah,
those things that is so important to
yeah,
everybody.
yeah.
Do you want me to give you a case study, a case I actually
Yes,
consulted on?
yes, please
So,
do. Because I think that's how a lot of the listeners or viewers are really going to be able to relate to
yeah,
everything. Yeah.
walk you through the main variables. So this was an adult person that had FASD. I consulted with the professionals involved, and this was a legal kind of forensic case. This client had a reduced ability to grasp reality. They had a high
Mm,
level of fantasy proneness.
okay.
So basically what that means is it they're not delusional, but they're really into like fantasy games and being
Hmm.
online and getting into kind of make believe worlds. So
All the
that was a
role-playing
variable.
games.
Yep.
Yeah.
So take that into account. So fantasy proneness could be a variable. This person had short and long-term memory deficits.
Mm,
If a person has memory problems and they can't remember something, I mean, that's a huge vulnerability, especially if you're
yeah.
being interviewed.
Yeah.
Planning, organization, and time management deficits were very, very common among this individual.
Mm,
If you are a person listening to this, and if you have a ton of planning, organization, time management deficits, those are all red flag indicators of executive function impairment.
mhm.
We all have them under the right circumstance,
Yeah.
but people with FASD a lot of times do have these deficits going on.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
person
and that's a
also,
good point that, all of us can have any of these quote unquote symptoms, but it
yes,
really is a matter of how often or to what degree they complicate life.
absolutely.
Yeah.
We all can have it going on, but under the right circumstance, we're really under the wrong
Yeah.
circumstance. This can be a massive, massive deficit for the client if they're
Yeah.
involved in the legal system or clinical or forensic.
Yeah.
This client also had a high degree of irritability and impatience. Why do
Mhm.
you want to care about that in an interview? Because after being questioned several times, the person just got so angry and upset. I think their brain probably shut down and they
Mhm.
wanted to say anything they could to get it done with.
Yeah.
So they're agreeing to things. They have no idea what was being asked of them. This person also had a high degree of obsessional tendencies. So during the interview, their brain was they were having obsessive thinking
Mhm.
about something totally different. So they're not even paying attention.
Yeah.
So these are a few things to consider that are vulnerabilities you'd want to consider in any interview you do
Yeah.
or group, whatever coaching, whatever you do. Anytime you talk to people, learn about these things. You'll be in a better position to probably get more accurate and reliable information from that person.
Yeah. And I think too, something that you just said about, um, you know, them being in the interview, but their head is somewhere completely different, right? Folks with FASD, we often wear a mask, right? And that's something that people, and we're not the only neurodiversity that does that, right? We've learned when it's appropriate to nod or say yes, or um, just so that nobody peeks under the hood, right? Yeah,
Reminders,
yeah,
definitely. Can I give you a few things to consider during an interview?
yes.
Just basic one-on-one stuff again. If people Google my name and type in like criminal justice interviewing, I've written a full series of topics on a whole series of articles related to best practices in interviewing. And one of them is on FASD. But again, every person is different. But if you're interviewing somebody, especially if they have some vulnerabilities, what do you want to keep in mind? Multi-step questions can be tricky. So one question at a time, maybe be okay with silence because in some cases, the person could be dealing with information processing deficits. So again, we've talked about this a few times in other episodes. But if you're interviewing someone with FASD who has information processing deficits,
Mm.
maybe you ask the question once, the person's sitting there and you're sitting in silence and you're starting to wonder, did that person hear what I said or are they just being defiant? Be okay with silence because maybe their brain is just spinning and
Yeah,
they're thinking.
yeah.
So that's something to think about.
And that also allows for processing deficits, right?
What?
Deficits. I
Yeah,
hate that word.
absolutely. Absolutely.
If there's processing speed issues. Yeah,
Without a doubt.
yeah,
And auditory too, because in some cases, people with FASD in some cases may not grasp every word being asked. They could
yeah,
have some auditory stuff going on.
yeah.
Now,
Yeah,
this is
we
hard.
listen slowly, right?
Yeah. And if we all listen more slowly, be more patient, better outcomes can happen.
Yeah.
This is hard for people who've never had training in this, but avoiding yes or no questions or true
Mhm.
and false questions on if you do ask those, don't rely on the head nod or the
Mhm.
back and forth. If you're interviewing someone with FASD and you ask yes or no questions, they might have a yes bias where they may say yes to a lot of things. If you don't fact check and verify every time that person says yes, you could be missing something. So for example, if I'm talking to someone with FASD and I ask them a yes question or no question, tell me what you just agreed to. You just nodded yes. Tell me in your own words what yes means to you. Just something
Mhm.
like that to really get in their own words
I
to
was
make
hoping
sure.
you'd give us an example.
Yeah, it's just a very practical example.
Yeah,
Limit the number of words used in a question because of working memory deficits. And if you're asking a lot of questions, make things more visual too.
mhm.
Maybe it's writing something down, giving more breaks,
Yeah,
avoid any misleading questions. And this is where it gets hard too. If you're asking the same question, as I mentioned before, over and over again, that could be very tricky. So be aware of repeated questions,
yeah,
asking it same time, same way over and over again. Those are
yeah.
just a few things to consider.
Now, I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of strategies that you can use in more of a relational situation, not an interview setting.
Be aware of the person's ability to take in information during a conversation. So, what kind of situation is it, and how much demand are you putting on their brain?
Mhm.
Take more breaks, go for a walk. If you're in a heated conversation with someone, you're in a relationship, maybe the person always wants to get to the end of the conversation or get to the end of the argument and solve it. It might not be able to be solved on your timeline. So
Mhm.
slow down. So executive function during an interview is so important. If we look at
Yeah.
it through that lens,
Yeah.
ask yourself, does that person have good comprehension and can they hang in there? Do they have a lot of grit? If they
Mhm.
get overwhelmed quickly, take breaks.
Yeah.
During your conversation with the person, do you know if they're hydrated? Did they have a good meal? Are they sleep
Mhm.
deprived?
Mhm.
Are they dealing with a undiagnosed learning disability?
Yeah.
So be aware of the vocabulary you choose as well.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, is the vocabulary too complex for that person's comprehension? Shifting attention can be tricky because if you're having a conversation, is there a lot of side chatter going on beside you? Is
Mhm.
the TV on? Is the radio? Are you
Yeah.
sitting in a restaurant and there's all kinds of conversations going around?
I struggle with that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
part of that is, filtering noises. If
sure.
I'm, for example, in a closed environment like a car or truck, and the volume is real high, I really struggle with conversation.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that tends to, yeah, I just don't do well. But the other thing I was thinking as you were talking, you mentioned earlier about power dynamics, right? And clearly, if we're being interviewed by the police, that's an obvious power dynamic. Same thing with doctors, therapists, but even in family relationships, there are still power dynamics. Parents have a clear power position of power. Um, But depending on the dynamics of the marital relationship, it can exist there also.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Definitely. So
yeah.
get to know your
Particularly
audience.
particularly with, those of the generation who are trained that women should, acquiesce to their husbands, right? That's a clear power dynamic. I'm thinking of my grandparents. Um, my mom used to talk about how it was so gender ranked by gender, right? So my grandfather would get the first choice of meat, right? And then it would go to her brother, and then to my grandmother, and then my mom, and then her younger sister. Um, and just, it seems odd because it wasn't, well, I guess it was that long ago because my mom's 91 now. But she's not the only one from that who was brought up that way, right? Yeah.
Very good reminders. Understanding those intergenerational dynamics,
Mhm.
cultural factors. I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many variables because this is a very dynamic process.
Mhm.
Every interviewer is different. Every setting is different. Every reason for why the person's being interviewed is different. And it could be a
Yeah.
family matter. It could be a clinical. It could be an education, criminal justice.
Mhm.
But regardless of what setting you're in, learning about some of these topics may help improve your communication, your interactional abilities, and the outcomes that
Mhm.
generate from that interaction you're having with that person.
So with this suggestibility, I'm curious about if the research says anything at all about the perspective of the person who has been manipulated, whether or not that was conscious. Um, are they how often, I mean, I don't even know if this has been looked at, but how often is there that awareness of, I don't buy into this, or does it kind of always flip over to confabulation?
I don't have solid statistics like how often that happens, but I would assume there's plenty of cases where the person knows what's happening doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they know that they're being taken advantage of,
Mm-hmm.
but they're compliant. So they go along with it on the outside. Internally, they disagree, but they won't
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah.
We're
Because
not
it's
talking about
easier.
autism. We're not talking about autism today per se, but the research in autism says that folks on the autism spectrum probably aren't more suggestible than the general population, but they're more compliant. The
Oh.
research on the FASD world kind of leans to the fact that they're more compliant and more suggestible
Mm-hmm.
and confabulate more.
Mm-hmm.
So every neurodevelopmental disorder too is different as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Such good points. Are there some strategies for, the listeners and the viewers who are either raising kiddos with FASD or partnered with someone with FASD? What can be done to strengthen their loved ones' cognizance of all this? Or strengthen their family relationships? How can they practically help?
Strengthening relationships, becoming attachment informed, trauma informed can be
Mhm,
very helpful. Getting to know the individual's strengths and resources, but also limitations and weaknesses.
mhm,
Forming a multidisciplinary helping team. So if that client has co-occurring depression or anxiety, maybe working with someone to tackle that.
okay.
If you know that individual has a sleep disorder, working with a sleep specialist. If you know that person seems to have addictive tendencies to fast food and sugar sweetened beverages, work with a nutritionist.
Mhm,
Sensory processing, language. So finding out what are the limitations. And I think the only way we know that is probably getting good evaluations, becoming
mhm,
familiar with the red flag indicators. Maybe the person's dealing with undiagnosed dyslexia or an undiagnosed memory or sense or information processing.
mhm,
It's so hard
mhm.
to say there's one thing to do. It's
Yeah,
usually a whole team of things to tackle different
yeah,
variables.
yeah. And I
And you, as the
think
caregiver, the more you can establish a safe,
mm,
consistent, loving, structured home,
mhm,
the research is clear that anybody growing up in a home like that typically does better than living in a home full of abuse and chaos and
right.
role reversals and all of those things.
Yeah. And I think with that, it's important to point out the distinction between physical safety and felt safety, right? Because if we do not feel safe, which is an emotional thing, not a cognitive thing, but if we don't feel safe, we're not going to learn, we're not going to trust, and we're going to be in our downstairs brain, right? Frequently, we'll just like go to defense, just like that, um, and which complicates everything.
It sure does.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I
Oh my
leave you
goodness.
with a couple
Oh, please do.
other topics to consider if people want to take it to the next level and if we ever want to follow up on this?
Okay.
When you study confabulation, you study suggestibility, I think it's important to understand the literature on gullibility.
Hmm.
Gullibility, poor judgment, being easily manipulated, tricked, scapegoated. You want to be aware of the topic of naivete,
Hmm.
where that might be a client that lacks good judgment, they lack wisdom, they lack experience. You want to be aware of the topic of acquiescence. So we talked about that a little bit before. They're more agreeable. And you want to be aware too of the topic of credulity. Most people have never even heard of that topic in my experience. Credulity. It's basically a willingness to go along and believe and trust things too easily, even if there's evidence to support the fact that maybe you shouldn't. So Source monitoring and reality monitoring deficits are two huge topics I wish we could have a full day on. Source monitoring is getting information mixed up where it happened, when it happened, and how it happened. And reality monitoring is getting things mixed up that did I actually witness it? Or did I dream it? Or did I imagine it? And the last one I'll just leave you with, and we could spend all day on other ones, is memory distrust. If a person doesn't trust their memory, they're much more likely to go along with other people's memories, especially if those other people's memories seem more believable, even though the research is so clear. Don't trust your memory, even if you think you're 100% accurate, because that doesn't equal accuracy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in the past I had followed up by looking at one of the references that you provided, and it was a YouTube video, and that's what it was about. Was the how do I want to say this? The inaccuracy of memory. Yeah.
Yeah. We're all
Yeah.
prone to memory errors.
Yeah. Okay. So we definitely have our topics lined out for future
We're good for another
episodes.
year.
I think we are. And I wanna honor your time commitment. I know you've got to roll in just a few minutes. So
Thank you.
everyone, I can't believe this hour just flash bang disappeared. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that it has given you a lot to think about as you look at things in your own life, your own history. If you're like me, living with FASD, I know it shined a spotlight on some things in my past. And for those of you who are caretaking, I hope that this has given you something else to think about as you support the person that you love. Please feel free to hop on over to Facebook and the group tab and look at Living with FASD podcast, and you can join our community there. And please like, share, whatever, the YouTube channel or the Spotify channel, or however it is that you are enjoying this podcast. Really appreciate that. Please drop me a line at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com if you want to suggest any topics or guests for me to have on future episodes. If you have any questions for Dr. Brown, because he'll be back. He's been gracious enough to come on roughly every 6 weeks. So anything that you want to know more about that he hinted at today, just let me know, and we'll have a little Q&A section at the beginning of our next episode together. But again, have a wonderful week, everyone. And don't forget to come back again next Monday for another episode of Living with FASD. Take care.